Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. Today it is January 1st, and that means that I can finally give you guys my top 10 reads of 2023. I am one of those people who absolutely cannot put out my top 10 reads video until December is over, because there's always that little voice in the back of my head that says, but what if one of your top 10 is read the last week of December or on December 31st? You never know about these things. So I waited until January 1st when I knew for sure I had put down the last page of 2023 and I could in good conscience give you guys my top 10. So in 2023 I read 102 books. That is the first time I think in my life, other than maybe tiny middle grade Tori who was reading every horse series at the library, that I've ever been able to say that I read 100 books in 1 year. Now, I'm not really one to pay a whole lot of attention to numbers because I'm more interested in reading amazing books and I don't really care how many, but it was just one of those goals that felt kind of cool to add to my bucket list. However, that made my top 10 a lot harder to decide on, because the more books you read, the harder it is to narrow down which books are at the top of the stack. Now, there were a couple of books on this list, including my book of the year, that I knew from halfway through the read that it was going to be on this list, and that has not changed all year. So there are a couple of books on this list that were just top teners from day one, and that hasn't shifted a bit. But it wouldn't be a top 10 list without some honorable mentions, because that's basically our BookTube way of giving more than 10 options for our top 10 reads. But these three books are definitely worth the honorable mentions, and I enjoyed reading all of them so very much that I wanted to make sure that I mention them here in the top 10 video. The first one is by my fellow indie author K.E. Andrews with The Assassin of Grins and Secrets. This is a book that I read very early on in the year because I was ready for some assassin fantasy, and I'm kind of starting to notice that around this time of the year I start getting in my assassin fantasy feels, because I'm there again now in January and I have another assassin book on deck that I'd really like to read. So anyway, I don't know what that means, but Assassin of Grins and Secrets follows the story of Serene, who is a veteran assassin who is employed by a young prince to kind of partially bodyguard, but also help him figure out what is going on at the palace and try to uncover a sinister plot against his family. Things get messy, and one of the things that I loved about this book, it is dark, it is incredibly creative and beautifully written, and I love that there is a trio of main characters that isn't a love triangle. So if you're looking for some really dark, beautifully written assassin fantasy, definitely be aware of the content warnings in this book, but it is a beautiful piece of fiction. Next up, we're going to take a little swerve into the classics area of SFF, and that is David Gemmell's Legend. I read this during, I think, March or April this year, and I had a really good time with it. I gave this book 5 stars, despite the fact that there is a trope in this book that I absolutely hate. Thankfully, that wasn't a huge plot line of the story, and that's why it kind of got pushed to the side, because the rest of this book is so good. It's just a solid veteran soldier defending a city for his last battle, and man, the way that the different relationships between the soldiers and this idea of how we hero worship our warriors through history is just so good. It's just so good. I had a great time with this book. My last honorable mention of this video is going to go away from SFF completely, and that is Gone to the Woods by Gary Paulsen. This is a memoir about American author Gary Paulsen, who writes about himself in third person here, and tells the story of his very tumultuous upbringing and how the woods and finding the joy of stories kind of saved his life in a lot of ways. And having had the opportunity to meet Gary Paulsen, I just really loved reading this. He has since passed away, but I just loved getting a little bit of an insight into who he is as a person and where he came from. Now, with no further ado, let's go into the top 10 of 2023. Now, while these are not ranked in any specific order other than I will be sharing my book of the year at the end of the video, I do kind of have them ranked into two tiers of sorts. So I'm going to start with tier 2, and these are my 10th, 9th, and 8th picks, and you can, I mean, I don't really have a ranking for them because I didn't really feel that that was necessary because I loved them all to it. The first one is Down Below Beyond by T.A. Bruno. This is a sci-fantasy standalone novel that just shocked me with how much I enjoyed it. It's one of those feel-good stories that has some great deep themes in it. The friendships in here, the alien races in here, I couldn't put it down. This is such a binge-worthy palate cleanser. I had a fantastic time with this book. One of the characters in this book I am still thinking about, and she will 100% be on my characters of the year list. I loved her so much. Floam, for anybody who's read it, if you know, you know, I adored her. And I just want more people to read this book, honestly. It is a great palate cleanser. It reads incredibly quickly, and T.A. Bruno has such a great, imaginative, cinematic storytelling style that this book was just a joy to read. I didn't read a lot of science fiction this year, but the ones that I did were bangers, and I'm not mad about it. So the next one on my list is The Martian by Andy Weir. I read this back in April as well, and man, I just had a blast with this book. The character of Mark Watney, who is an astronaut who is stranded on Mars, and there's really no way for him to survive until he can be picked up and rescued by the rest of the space program. It's just an incredible story. Mark Watney's narrative as a character is so poignant, it's so funny, it's so bleak, it's so perseverant. I mean, it's just such a blast to read this book. I loved this book. I laughed so much. I cried at the end. It's a solid book, and I can completely understand why so many people love it. The next one up on this list is a book that is one of my favorite first books in a trilogy that I've read in a long time, and it is kind of now become my standard for where I start with liking grimdark, and that is We Are the Dead by Mike Shackle. This book takes place over the span of 8 days. It is the tale of ordinary people being launched into the front lines of a horrific invasion after the real heroes, quote unquote, have all been wiped out. And man, those 8 days, Mike Shackle knows how to drive some tension, you guys. It is so brutal, but there's this thread of purpose and hope and resilience through it that I absolutely loved. Again, I have a character in here that is definitely going in my top 10 characters of 2023. I loved him. While it is definitely grimdark in the brutality of the story and the dark tension and the hopelessness that exists here, through it all there's this thread of purpose, and I really, really loved that. I don't do straight nihilism when it comes to grimdark. That's just not what I enjoy reading, and so this for me was a great grimdark experience. We're gonna go into the next tier of this top 10 list, and these are just books that I had a hard time, like I wouldn't have been able to rank them, so that's kind of why I just threw them in tiers, because I don't know. But the first book in this tier that I loved was another book that I read early on in the year. The first half of 2023 especially, man, there were some great reads in those first few months, and I had a great time with Seasons of Albidones. This was one of the first books I read this year. It's a tiny little thing. It is written by Chris Warman and Elon Marche, and they are a husband and wife duo that created something that's kind of like a perfect marriage between Hayao Miyazaki's Studio Ghibli films versus Grimm's fairy tales. Don't let the cover fool you, because it's not light and fluffy. It has some incredibly punchy, moral kind of fairy tale style stories in it. There's 4 of them. Each kind of ties into the others in the locale that they take place in. And this book shocked me with how much of a punch it carried, how much I continued to think about it after I was reading it. The second story is by far my favorite of the 4, but all 4 of them are just so beautiful and tightly woven, and Elon and Chris have really found a way to make co-authoring work for them, because this is a beautiful indie triumph. Next up is a book 3 of a series that I finished this year, and this is a series that I'm going to be just thinking about and processing for a long time, because the complex feelings that I have about this series and the characters and the choices that are made just really go to show how much of a master this author is at creating a powerful story that takes place over the lifetime of the characters in it. And that is Jade Legacy by Fonda Lee. This is the 3rd book in her Greenbone saga, which is 3 novels. It also includes a short story collection and a novella, which I also read this year. If somebody would have told me that this series, one of the books of this series, might end up on my top 10 list after reading book 2, I might have been a little skeptical, because book 2 really, I struggled with it. I wasn't sure where it was going to go. I wasn't sure if this landing was going to stick. And man, the amount of feelings I'm feeling about this trilogy, I don't even know how to describe how I feel about this trilogy. I will be thinking about it for ages. This is such an incredible masterpiece, and I love Fonda Lee's way of creating a saga about the ordinary lives of people who change the world around them, and how those changes affect the world and generations, both prior and future. And it's a family epic, basically, and it's incredibly well done. Moving on to another series that I absolutely adored this year, and man, it was hard to pick. Of the 3 books that are currently available in this series so far, trying to choose my favorite was really difficult. But I think I've narrowed it down to book 2, which is The Spider Key by Jacqueline Hagan, book 2 of the Riverfall Chronicles. This is a debut series, you guys. Oh my goodness. This is Howl's Moving Castle meets Oliver Twist. We have a Artful Dodger style main character named Inkwell Featherfield, who gets thrown into this band of misfit fugitives from the law, who are supposedly these terrible, horrible people that have done these terrible, horrible things. And he starts getting to know them and realizes maybe the stories that are being told aren't exactly the truth. Spider Key is the 2nd book, and it really ups the tension in the series, and I just had an absolute blast with it. If you've been waiting to put this series on your TBR, I cannot recommend it highly enough. All right, we are down to the top 4 on my list of top 10. And I honestly don't know that I can rank these, you guys. These are books that just blew me away this year, that I feel like just in reading them made me a better writer. Made me more aware of myself as a reader, and I learned so much in reading them, and I'm still in awe, and I honestly just want to go back in time and reread them all for the first time again, because they're still sitting with me after all this time, and it's a beautiful thing. In no particular order, we are going to start with Spirits of Vengeance by Rob J. Hayes. This is book 3 in his Mortal Techniques series. It is a wuxia Asian-inspired magic system. We have dragons, we have yokai, we have vengeful spirits, we have meddling gods within this story and world. We have some incredible characters through this series, but book 3, Spirits of Vengeance, just floored me. I loved it. I love the visuals. I love the characters. I loved the depth that Rob J. Hayes explores with those characters. I loved the world building is just so cool, and the way the magic is utilized is so interesting and fresh and brings to mind all of the things I loved about Asian storytelling, especially the animes that I grew up with and a lot of the Asian martial arts films. I will definitely be rereading the series, and I am more than thrilled that Rob is planning on writing more books in the series because I loved this book so much. It also takes the cake for one of my absolute favorite side characters, who you can see as this tiny little black fluffy thing next to Haruto, and that is Shiki, and she is an adorable little spirit character who the Cinnamon Roll Award, let me tell you. Next up on this tier, we have the longest book that I read this year. It was a chonk, but man was it worth it. It's always a little intimidating to go into books of this size because you're like, man, this is an investment, right? This is a story that I'm gonna have to commit to for an extended period of time, and it's always the most fulfilling feeling ever when that pans out and pays off. That is Shogun by James Clavell. I read this book this year with a group of booktube friends, and we read it over 3 months, and it's 1,300 pages, and it is a chonk. But let me tell you what, almost not a word in this entire book is wasted. I was just in awe of how James Clavell gives us this story of feudal era Japan told from the perspective of an English ship's captain who is marooned and shipwrecked on the shores of Japan in the 1600s and has to survive a very polite, very structured culture that is in equal parts exceptionally brutal. And man, it is incredibly epic, this story, and I am definitely going to be reading this one again. I just was amazed by how much I enjoyed this story. I loved it. It's incredible, and everyone should not be afraid of reading it because it will be an amazing payoff. All right, guys, we have 2 more left. The next one on my list is The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. Now, obviously, there are 4 books in this omnibus edition, and I'm not picking all of them because I'm only doing 1 book per author in this video, but I think this was the hardest one to narrow down. Out of all the series that I read this year, this one was the toughest to decide which of the 4 books I could possibly pick as my favorite, because they're all so good. They're all so good. But I think I settled on A Betrayal in Winter, which is book 2 of the Long Price Quartet. And I think it was in book 2. I knew that this was going to be an amazing series in book 1, but I think at book 2, that's when I really realized the depth to which I was going to love this series. And I think that's why it has a little bit of an edge above the other 3. But honestly, trying to pick one of the 4 was so hard. And how often does that happen in series where every single book in this omnibus edition could have been on this list, no questions asked? This is a story that, again, kind of deals with the epic saga of a single life and how the choices 1 or 2 or a small group of people make change the world around them over a large span of time. And I'm discovering that I really love that in storytelling, which is really cool. I had a great time with both this and Greenbone Saga this year for that reason. And Daniel Abraham's prose and the depth to which he explores his characters, it's some of the most beautiful character writing I have ever come across. And the magic system in Long Price Quartet is so unique and so interesting and just mind-blowing in some areas. And I can't tell you guys enough how underrated this series is. If you are ready for some rich prose and some slow burn masterpiece fantasy, this should be on your TBR. And the beautiful part about it is they're each only 250 pages long. So really, what do you have to lose? All right, guys, last but not least on this tier, Augustus by John Williams. This is a historical fiction book told in an epistolary format, which basically means it's told in the form of letters, about Caesar Augustus, one of the most famous Roman emperors of all time. It tells the story of his rise to power and his trying to manage that power, and then his attempt to figure out the succession of that power. And again, this goes over the span of his adult life, so you get that kind of lifetime all packed into a flawlessly written book. In my opinion, this is one of the technically best books I have ever read. It is so powerful. It gives the story of Augustus through so many different lenses of the people who knew and loved him and the people that hated him, the people that grew up with him. I loved this book so much, and I think that it should be on everyone's TBR. That is officially my top 10, and now it is time to tell you my official book of the year. This was so hard to pick. It was so hard to pick, and honestly, I could probably pick 5 or 6 books on this list that easily could have taken this spot, no questions asked. But the book that I've been thinking about the most, the book that impacted me, I think, the most as a reader and as a writer this year, was Augustus by John Williams. This is my book of the year. It's incredible. I would recommend this to pretty much any reader, with some exceptions, but honestly, wow. Wow, this is an incredible piece of storytelling. I was absolutely blown away by it, and I am still thinking about it and want to reread it as soon as I can. So it should be on your TBR if it's not already, and if you've read it, you know it's incredible. But yeah, thank you guys so much for following me along on this amazing year of reading in 2023. You guys are incredible. I hope you had an awesome year in 2023. Drop your book of the year down in the comments below. Check out my description box for all of the important links around my channel. And I hope you guys are reading 5-star reads. I hope that you are having an amazing first week of January, and I will see you in the next video.